I think this time, Nathan, we're going to have to put you on the spot since most of these links came from you.
I think all of these links came from me. They're not all about Mythos. It's just sort of a smorgasbord, mostly stuff from there's a Signal chat that a bunch of current and former coworkers run, and also some of our management is in it. So links that are getting dropped in that as people went through. I basically grabbed everything that was cybersecurity plus AI since April 1st. And then there's a few that are ones that I found really kind of formative to my thinking. So to be perfectly honest, the cybersecurity is proof of work is probably, that did not come from that chat. I forget where I found that link, but that has probably been the most influential thing I've read on my own thinking with respect to Mythos. So I guess to just sort of like, where does it feel like everything is to me? You know, Mythos is billed as a step change. It feels like it is an important improvement, but I think it's not as much of a big change as Anthropic has laid it out to be. It seems pretty obvious now that a lot of the smarts, like we kind of already knew that a lot of smarts lived in the harness, but it's more and more the experiments people are doing seems to be putting that a lot of what we think of as the smarts here, it lives in the harness. It's how you handle the situation, the problem. It's how you chunk it up, and you can use much more lower end models. And to a certain extent, some of that what you're trading off there is you need sort of more help from the harness, and you need more time to get good results. But you're willing to spend that time. You can very much sort of substitute money from time for time, and I think that's something that maybe hasn't sunk in for a lot of people yet. I think people are still sort of focused on the digital godhead, whatever role it is, whether it's wiping out industries or humanity or whatever. But it really does seem to be like, for practical purposes, it's already here. It's been here for a while, and people just haven't realized that you can have fast godheads or slow godheads, and we have slow godheads. So I think that's a thing. I think there are some interesting second order effects. So Anurag put a thing posted in the channel about the proof of work piece, where basically cybersecurity starts boiled down to how much money do you have to throw at it, or my formulation, how much time. There's a question of how fast you can patch. I think those are both right, but I think the second order effects are maybe more interesting. I think I'm very skeptical that the speed of patching can be significantly improved in the real world. I think there's a lot of reasons why patching is slow. Teams are very overworked. AIs can help with some of that, but I'm just not convinced that you're going to be able to up the rate a lot there. And I think that's going to mean that defense and depth in the short term is going to become a lot more important. That's also going to become a regulatory problem, because there's especially European regulations really look at sort of the defenses at the component level, at the unit level. And we may be entering an era where the defenses at the unit level are just always inadequate. And I'm not really sure how the regulations handle that. That's really pessimistic. I think in the long term, we're in for a rough state patch, but eventually things are going to get hard. It may take a while because maintainers may get very overloaded, but open source projects will get hardened. Closed source projects will get hardened. We may start seeing a slower pace of software development because you may start seeing in paid software kind of mandatory hardening periods using these sort of AI tools. I wouldn't be surprised if in the open source world you start seeing an adoption of more of what you might think of as like defensive development, something more like how NASA develops things, where you're just being super, super careful about everything. That's going to probably lead to a world that's just a lot safer from a software level. But attackers go where things are weak, and so that is going to also shift the burden of attack away from software and more towards human compromise. So I think you're going to see a lot more social engineering in the decades ahead. You're going to see a lot more, probably you're going to start seeing bribery and extortion cases. Um, people actually being threatened into opening up things in their network for attacks. So while I think software might become safer, it does seem like from a human level, the internet may become much more hostile because of this, because all of us have access to something that somebody might want to get into. Um, I think last note, and then I guess I will pass up, is sort of adjacent to, this all feels kind of very bitter lesson adjacent. And I feel like there's a lot of, I see in my industry, a lot of there's been a lot of layoff earlier because of this, because of people thinking that AI was going to replace things. There's been some more hiring. What I've seen anecdotally is that the hiring has mostly been people who have been kind of more AI friendly, and the people who are very AI skeptic are still looking for jobs months later. They are increasingly bitter about it. And I think there's a lot of people who are, gleefully hoping, more and more people sort of gleefully hoping in this industry that things sort of crash down. I don't think that may happen, but like, they're going to claim vindication because eventually there will be some kind of market correction. And they've been claiming that there's going to, it's all going to fall down among our ears for months now. And so, the stop clock is right twice a day, as they say. Um, Adjacent to this being kind of feeling like this sort of bitter lesson adjacent to, and all the smarts living in the harnesses, um, does make me actually also a lot more bullish about open source in the long term in this field. It feels like small specialized models, especially if it's models that could run locally, may actually be a lot more feasible with good harnesses. There's nothing to restrict those good harnesses to big corporations. There's no big secret sauce there. So I expect there to be really good harnesses eventually coming out of the open source world there. And it does make me think that a lot of the small special purpose, maybe local models, or may wind up out competing what you might think of as the charismatic mega models in many real world niches. And if you think about this, this is very much how like real world ecologies work. Like generalists, like humans, generalist species are not super common. Most species specialize to some degree, and that would probably be true of models and harnesses. So I don't think you're going to, you may, in the long term, this may mean that you just don't see very many special generalist models, that most models are specialized. So those are my thoughts on the current state of play. Happy to give more thoughts or answer questions, within reasons. But for now, I will pass up to Ben.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that was you covered a lot of what I wanted to was probably going to end up saying. But it's very interesting. I do like the idea of a proof of work sort of, and I think in the short to meso scale, that's probably the case. All right, Anthropic keeps talking about step change. So I think the actual, thing that's going on here is a phase transition. And it's not just because of Mythos, which I still consider to be one of the best marketing things I've ever seen. I mean, I guess I know it's probably very good and probably has lived up to some of the hype, but I also think that their marketing on it has just been so good that sometimes I am like question like, does this actually do anything? But and But phase transitions, we're going from a regime where there was no AI tools and the system was sort of modeled on that to where there is AI scanning, and that's going to shape where the bottlenecks are. And during the transitionary period, there's of course going to be a huge mess. What happens in the long run, like what new equilibriums emerge? That's interesting. I don't really have too much thoughts on that. I do think there's probably equilibriums here that are not just attackers always win or something. But I do think things are going to have to change significantly, like across the whole system, like a phase transition. Um, and until that transition fully crystallizes, it's going to be hard to know exactly where things are headed. Yeah, but definitely in the short term, there's this proof of work. But you also have to think that from an individual perspective, it's you versus the attacker. But from sort of a more systematic perspective, it's everyone versus all the attackers. So it's like, so even if the attackers can outspend, say, a small project, the attackers are not just, focusing on a project. They have like the entire world of projects to worry about that they're trying to attack, or, if they might have, separate goals. So, and their resources are still finite too. So, it's sometimes you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the person next to you, sort of thing. Where if you're being hyper focused, um, though I did want to something else I've been thinking of, how nation states interact with this sort of thing is interesting in that it almost feels like in this cyber domain, the sort of sovereignty that nation states have isn't really possible. Like there's no way to generate a zone that is what's it the one legitimate source of violence sort of thing. It's like, and previously nation states could, take they do take territory and can mostly have a legitimate, monopoly of violence on that territory. But in the cyber realm, there's not really territory like that, and you can't actually stop the different entities from existing. Um, if the physical actual war is not really a possibility, and as I think in the past decade it's shown that's not really the case. I mean that's sort of the case where there hasn't been a lot of successful conquerings, uh, but not to get too far into that. More like, if there's a regime where there's no possibility of actually anyone establishing a territory there that's that they can truly have a monopoly of force on, and it's always just going to be a mess where everyone's fighting. Um, and that's interesting. It doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do, but it means that the attackers and defenders never really go away. Like it's not really possible for someone to conquer someone else in this situation, or to like it's very difficult to make them stop existing, and that's true on both sides. So North Korea keeps hacking American stuff forever, and America keeps hacking, or doing what defense they can, and then striking back when they can. And it never really comes to a conclusion like an actual war would, because there's no way to really conquer the territory of the other cyberly. Anyway, that was a weird tangent. But how does this work with AI tools? Yeah, like I said, in the short run, it might just be you have to, but I do think specialized models. That's something I've thought about for a while in terms of like in general. I think that the American current way of doing things of just spam scale infinitely, try to create a super uber monopoly and take over everything. Um, I think that in the long run, a more sharply trained model is going to be a lot more effective, especially if it's more efficient from a proof of work perspective, because then you can um, but also just I think the way software, especially open source, is going to change how sort of it's socially structured. So rsync, I don't know if you know about the rsync thing that went on recently, but basically if you ever used command line tools, you probably might have used rsync, which is sort of like a way of transferring files or syncing files between two machines or locations. And what recently happened with rsync is that the maintainer on it got really into AI coding and really into divide coding his stuff. And a lot of people are angry, because he seems to be degrading the quality of his product. And it has to do with the fact, I think, there's a lot of anti-AI stuff, but also in general, my immediate reaction to this is actually, it's not so much that he's using AI to change his product. It's that, people thought rsync was stable. They thought, this was a well-used tool. It's like, like SCP or some other SSH or something. I mean, yes, these are all technically projects, technically with maintainers and stuff, but it always assumed that these are just ROPs, you build your house out of the rock, and then the rock doesn't change very much, except maybe in like critical bug situations or whatever. Um, but it's oh yeah, interesting. I have to read that link. I haven't actually paid too much attention to the rsync thing. I just know it exists. Um, but what it does seem like, and maybe maybe he was just fixing bugs or trying to change his tests or whatever. Um, but certainly, like in the long run, I think things are going to be like there's going to be a set of like public open source packages that are like really simple and really hardened, and that if you want to actually use them, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to like take multiples of them or take one of them and feed it into your AI, and then have it give you the actual features you need based on the secure brick, versus having the AI, sorry, the open source sort of project be like competing directly with say the closed source project, like Photoshop versus GIMP or something, where it's the whole package that matters. But I think where you end up with much more like specialized tools that with AI it's much easier to grab them and hammer and put them together into something that you can actually use that is both specialized for you, and then uh, hopefully that allows you to sidestep a lot of these issues. Anyway, I think I'm rambling. I've rambled on enough. I'll pass up to Anraj.
Well, uh, the second order effects, I was mostly thinking about them, and like I kept thinking about a lot of the embedded stuff. So in the embedded world, generally you don't the product remains in the field for like 10 years, and usually like there is no way to like update it, at least if there is no like firmware update or over the air update. So you basically like are like programming something and sending it to the field. And previously, like one of the defenses was like it's really hard to like get to know the or program the hardware itself. But with AI, it's becoming easier, and so there are a lot of older stuff lying around. A lot of the uh, a lot of older tech stuff does work on them, and like this opens up a lot of uh, probable like attack surface for systems that cannot be patched. And like about the human factors, like at least like the senior citizens might have difficulty in like defending against social engineering attacks. Like I don't know if how much of this can be solved immediately, uh, but at least like it seems like the more you spend, like you can defend better. But then like the attackers might try to generate or like have an attack similar to what happened in the XZ uh, like attack, and basically try to overwhelm some obscure open source tool with a single maintainer, and then basically it's like attack where there is a supply chain vulnerability and of something of that sort. um yeah, those were some initial thoughts, and then passing on to Anant or Venkat. I don't know if Anant is speaking.
Yeah, looks like Anant is on mute. Yeah, this was a interesting fishing expedition. Uh, I read parts of the Forester thing personally. The rest is just talking to ChatGPT. Yeah, there's I think a few levels of effects, not just first order and second order. So based on like a ChatGPT conversations, all my comments are based on that. But the uh, second order effect is the system versus model point, right? So more capable model does not equal, you know, linearly increased intensity of arms race on both attack and defense side. All of this is on the attack side for some reason. I would think people also should pay attention to More capable models also make defense easier. So I didn't see much discussion of that. But okay, so first order is it just increases the intensity of the arms race on both the attack and defense side. What you could call the third order effect is harness versus model, right? So a lot of these links basically dwell on that you can do a lot with simple models. You don't need mythos. It all depends on how you put the capabilities together. So I would bundle all that together into domain specific harness engineering. So it is like Cloud Code, but specifically for security work. You have a different tool set available and a different set of skills and so forth, but it's fundamentally harness engineering. So that's, I would call it the third order effect. The fourth order effect is probably the thing that both the proof of work and Forrester articles get to. And initially, ChatGPT seemed to think that they're making slightly different points. So Forrester's surface level point is discovery becomes abundant and essentially free, whereas proof of work says no, it does not become abundant in the sense of free, but it does become a commodity, which means the more you're willing to spend, the more you can mine, right? So I think there are two subtly different ways of making the same point, but both of them kind of have the same sort of like sociological profile of you're moving away from an artisanal industry of the equivalent of master craftsmen making watches by hand, for example. Watches are on my mind because I'm reading a book about watches. But yeah, that industry went through a transition where master craftsmen were replaced by uh, standardized parts and then interchangeable parts and then finally mechanized manufacturing, something like that, right? But these are two different trajectories to what you could call the industrialization of security. Path one, which is the first reading of the Forrester path, is that it becomes extremely cheap and you kind of get like some sort of mass economics of security. And the proof of work point is no, it's not exactly mass economics, but it's commodity economics. So I haven't yet quite thought through the differences in those two. But that's what reminded me of the link I posted, which is Steve Waldman's Interfluidity blog from almost 15 years ago, I think, where he made the point that insurance is one of the few consumption items that does not respect the law of diminishing marginal returns, which means like the more money you have, the more security or insurance you can buy. In Waldman's case, he's talking specifically insurance. And if you're a particular kind of rich person who's like endlessly scared of reality and you have endless amounts of money to spend, there's no limit to how much you can spend on insuring yourself against disasters, right? Like you have enough money, you buy multiple houses, then you buy yourself a bunker in Idaho, then you buy yourself a second citizenship and a bigger bunker in New Zealand. Then, I don't know, you build a space program to get off planet if an asteroid is coming at the planet. You spend all your money trying to live forever and research longevity and immortality. So I see all that as not just thought experiments, but real world sort of like proof points of Waldman's thesis that the marginal market for insurance is does not diminish. And actually, I saw a similar point being made again about 10-15 years ago in this book called The Phoenix Project, which was about DevOps. So it's a fictionalized account of so if you guys remember, there was a book called The Goal in the 80s, which was very popular in the supply chain world. It popularized the critical path method. And the Phoenix Project is the DevOps equivalent of that. So moving it from manufacturing and factories to cloud factories, I guess. And there's a character in that novel who's basically is a security guy. In the older novel, the role was played by a finance guy. But yeah, the security guy in the Phoenix Project basically doesn't understand the weighting of risks, which is that, just because a risk exists doesn't mean you have to spend all the money you have addressing it. It's a question of like, the probability weight of that risk, but also like, the negative utility of it. Like you ask yourself, all right, if this is a scenario that can play out and like, 1% chance it'll happen, and the cost of the hack is like, $100 million, the probability adjusted cost of the hack is $1 million. So that's already setting like a ceiling on how much you should spend to address it. But then you're also not taking into account facts like, all right, an active defense will kick in, there'll be mitigations, things will happen. And it might turn out that in the cost analysis, the and the importance of the hack is like $5, and you should not spend more than $5 on it. And you can kind of make sense. It makes sense even in more general terms, right? Not just IT security, right? Like, I mean, there is a chance that crazy evil aliens will attack us right now, and we should all be making preparations to survive crazy alien attack. But as far as I can tell, the median amount we are all spending on it is $0, because we've done the weight calculations and stuff. And the novel's point was that a lot of security people get so kind of like into their own heads in security that they can't actually make the weighted risk assessments and like rationally think about what is it actually worth to spend on this. And this is actually similar to the billionaire mistake on spending endlessly on insurance against like, zombie apocalypse type things. So I think this is kind of like maybe the Waldman article sort of synthesizes the Forrester and proof of work arguments to some extent. Um, it's a commodity article, it's a commodity market, and it's sort of abundant enough in the sense that tokens are cheap enough that you could actually spend endlessly. So, yes, it's a commodity, but it's not just a commodity, it's a cheap commodity. So, with reasonable spending on both attack and defense, you can now live in a dark forest that's 100 times more intense than you used to, and nobody's better off because both sides are spending, right? So that's one way to think of it. But the other way to think of it is the bottleneck. So this is, I guess, if I'm counting my levels right, this is the fifth order effect. It's the psychology level of the game, which is at some level, if you're getting sucked into both attacker and defender are spending respectively, like, 100x as much and discovering 100x as much vulnerabilities, uh, you now have like a far more dark foresty world where far too many resources are being spent on this. Uh, Maybe what you need is actually a mindset shift of get out of the insurance is infinitely valuable mindset and just accept that you're going to live a riskier life and change uh, kind of more things up front. So maybe more security by design, maybe shrink attack surfaces and organize around much more illegible ways of organizing, right? So this is what, for example, guerrilla uh, movements do when like a big oppressive attacker attacks. uh, what happens in a small country like the US against the Viet Cong or something, the defense kind of retreats to a smaller, yeah, the defense retreats to a much smaller attack surface. It sort of introduces diversity into its ecology. It engineers more obscurity into the landscape. And I think we talked previously about um, security through obscurity is no longer as powerful, but still, you can do all these things. And all these things, I think, are more creative responses that are not the same as spending indefinitely infinite amounts on insurance. You're kind of changing the game so that uh, risk takers are more advantaged to not spend all their money on insurance and instead like rearrange the landscape so they can continue to do other things like have fun. And once you start talking about the psychology level of the game, you can also kind of update the game theoretic assessments of like, make it less worthwhile for everybody to like go down this dark forest path. And I remember, I think we talked about this as well before, like 10 years ago, people were saying all the security agencies of the world are in a Mexican standoff because everybody has fully penetrated everybody else's systems and has compromised on everybody else. Well, this is the same thing, except now it's not just all the intelligence agencies of the world. It's every attacker and defender above a certain level of capability is kind of like fully interpenetrated. So the game theory has changed. But maybe that means you can like do, I don't know, iterated prisoners dilemmas type stuff and somehow get to better equilibria than everybody's overspending on security. So it feels like we're missing some creative avenues here out of what's fundamentally a fear-based, uncreative trap of going down the dark forest route. So I haven't yet thought through what that would look like, but it feels like that is going to open up. Like this is nowhere to live. Let me put it that way. Like if we go down this path, nobody will want to live this way, and everybody will want to be looking for a way out. So yeah, it's my thought. So floor's open for the
Really
thoughts.
good pull on that interfluidity. I've read that article before, but I wasn't thinking of it in terms of this. So yeah, it's interesting.
I think in general, I hadn't really thought about this in terms of insurance, but I really like that point. It is having been in a situation with like interacting with like design policies and interacting with corporate legal and whatnot, not in my current job, but previously. It is remarkable how strongly insurance drives business decisions. Um, and a lot of that, some of that is just risk aversion. But some of that is also that there are increasingly legal requirements around that, about having certain levels of insurance. So you're not allowed to take those risks. And then you sort of wind up getting this kind of iterative thing where you have to have a set of certain kinds of insurance. And then that to get that, certain behaviors become dictated. Um, and I've thought about that previously in terms of that it feels like, on the one hand, it's good that people have insurance that you want to cover, have some fallback so that low probability events don't wipe you out. But on the flip side, like it does feel like we've somehow become overly cautious. And it's created a situation where we become overly cautious. And this idea of cybersecurity being a cheap commodity, and so much of cybersecurity compliance is driven by insurance. Um, I would say almost all of it in the U.S. And then there's some other countries that are maybe more regulatory regimes, but like it's one of those two that drives a lot of it. But then the flip side is like one reason for that is that a lot of times, you in the software space and the hardware space, you make a thing, you sell it, you sort of like wash your hands of it. There's enough like sort of knobs and fiddly bits that you can kind of say, well, well, if you would actually configured this correctly, then this XYZ wouldn't have happened. But then configuring it correctly is not actually necessarily a practical option. So it's a hard thing, but it does make me think of just hearing Venkat's thoughts makes me think that delving into the interplay of kind of um, risk decisions in business and personal life and insurance mandate and regulatory mandates, that sort of interplay might be kind of an important thing to understand in how this evolves.
Yeah, this is probably way far afield from this topic, um, but in a way, any sort of like broad cultural movement into dark forest type regimes, uh, I'm trying to think if there are good historical examples besides the most recent one of crypto. So maybe the European Middle Ages is an example, and they used to call it the Dark Ages, and to some extent that label is still justified. But part of it was kind of a failure of the imagination after the fall of the Roman Empire to kind of like, think about the upside of just being alive at any level from individual to civilization and thinking that, hey, there's like good stuff out there as well, and we should craft a narrative that takes risks in order to get to the good stuff. And when that side collapses, and I guess that's what people call meaning crisis, there's a tendency to like obsessively get sucked into the darker side and spiral into this what I would call dark forest mindset of like endlessly buying insurance, and like it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that you get into a Hobbesian conflict zone. Yeah, another example I can think of is right after the Black Death, the condition of Europe in the second half of the 14th century, um, it collapsed for about 100 years into basically Hobbesian deep civil war, where there were like mercenary companies running around with private armies, and kings would be paying them to go away and trouble some other kingdom. And part of the and death cults were very popular because a lot of people in the Black Death era interpreted the Black Death as the end of the world and lost all hope. And the way that manifested was death cults became extremely popular. So it was kind of like a fatalist thing. And you saw a little bit of that around COVID, but not as much. I guess modern people are a little more evolved, though not by much. But there's something about uh, dark forest thinking, and kind of like uncreative responses to face changes in, I guess, threat environments is a failure of the positive imagination. So it doesn't seem immediately coupled, but if you have like nothing to live for, you're more likely to go down this path. Whereas if you have something interesting to live for, chances are you'll not go down this path. And this is not just true of like, idealists and visionaries who might be hoping for, I don't know, colonizing Mars or something, or curing cancer or whatever everybody's favorite idealist vision is. I think this is actually also true of people we think of as being on the dark side of civilization. So, criminal underworlds, gangs, warlords, all those kinds of like dark underbelly side of civilization, which always exists. They're not relentlessly bleak people with incentives and motivations to keep the world in a dark forest forever. That's not a realistic human profile. Yes, there are like some true psychopaths who get off on like mass murder and so forth, but most people kind of like are forced into that by, I don't know, circumstances and vicious cycles, which means with the right incentives, they'll actually want to get out of it. And there's some evidence for this, right? Like one of the famous examples of getting out of prisoner's dilemma, iterated prisoner's dilemma, is from World War One, where Germans and Allies were shooting across trenches at each other, and spontaneously there was kind of a cooperation equilibrium that emerged around Christmas time, where they did, like, this was not a top-down order, but infantry on both sides decided we're just going to stop shooting at each other for a week, and then they crossed into no man's land and like exchanged gifts and cake and stuff like that. So it tells you that even in like dark forest conditions, human psychology normally does not actually want to be there. Like nobody actually enjoys being in a dark forest, and that metaphor is maybe overworked. Like the Shikshin Liu's novel has a very contrived premise in one sense, where the Trisolarans are coming from like absolutely desperate situation of like a completely horrible. So I'm spoiling this for those of you who haven't read it, but the premise is they live in a system with three suns where orbits are so chaotic that life on the one habitable planet is like completely horribly unpredictable. Like you get intense summers, like crazy weather, all that kind of stuff. Like, civilization cannot take root because orbital mechanics tears it apart too chaotically. And that's why they're like looking for any way out of their hellhole. And that's why they have the hellhole type mentality they do, where they're willing to destroy other people just to get out of their own hell. I don't think this is true of like even the worst corners of life on Earth. Like Earth is actually not that hellish a place. Anyway, sorry, that was like a long digression into something else of like the mass psychology of this. Anyway, any last burning thoughts before we wrap up? All right, thanks everybody. See you guys next week for the Ethereum track.